Okay. Sir, we have a mic.
I'd like to ask more about the KYC platform. You mentioned about the two banks. Can I know which are these banks?
Yung KYC platform that I mentioned, no, is the banks have to sign up for that with the Bankers Association of the Philippines. No? The big banks right now are still in discussions because of the trade considerations. But there are other banks. I think you'd have to get in touch with your bank because they will have to tell you that they're already offering it because there's an app that they will ask you to download. So the application you will download will be done by your bank. So it will be specific to every bank because you will have to accept if there is a request for another bank, let's say bank number 2, to get from your original bank all your documents. So if they're not offering that yet to you, most probably they are not part yet of the BAP ID registry. But this has been launched since last year, January of 2019. And we hope that we in the PSC can actually also take advantage because there's around more than almost 30 million bank accounts amongst all the banks. No? So can you imagine if we can tap that in the PSC, make it easier for them to, let's say, share with the broker the KYC documents for their reference. No? I think you will have to check with your bank because officially we are not aware if all the banks, I'm sure, will communicate with you.
Okay. My follow-up question is I'd like to know which are the two name of the banks.
Example lang ho yun, Bank 1, Bank 2.
Okay.
Ibig sabihin, you have an existing bank account with Bank 1, and then you want to have another bank account in Bank 2. So that's an example of, because that's why they are sharing. Bank 1 will share with Bank 2.
So right now, wala pang...
There are small banks already.
I'd like to know which are those small banks that you are referring to.
I'll get that information for you kasi ang mangyayari is the banks will have to offer their product to you first.
Okay.
Baka mali yung maibigay kong name sa'yo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Next question. Yes, sir.
This is regarding REITs. Can you explain further how it operates? For example, SM Prime, it will form a REIT company. It decides to transfer ownership of some malls to this REIT. That means it is actually selling the malls to the REIT company. How does SM Prime benefit from it if the ownership already transferred to REITs?
Very good question. No? So, to structure a REIT, it's either you already have a company that is not yet listed with land on it, and you either build the property on it, which is not the case in the case of SM. No. Second example is already have in one listed company certain income-producing real assets. So you're right, you will have to carve it out. And normally the way they do that will be they will create a new corporation that is a special purpose corporation. There are requirements for capitalization. The minimum requirement is 300 million capitalization pesos. So to fund that, you will have to inject assets, and normally that will be a share for asset swap, and it will still be owned 100% by the original owners, which is in this case, example, the Cs. How will they benefit from it? Because there will be tax incentives on the REIT corporation once it is listed. Because as I said, the taxable income right now is taxed at, let's say, 35%. After the REIT has qualified, the income before tax will have a further deduction by way of the dividend distribution. By law, the requirement is for you to distribute dividends, and you can claim that as additional deduction. Right now, ordinary corporations cannot claim dividends distributed as additional deduction. So, for example, you earn 100 million pesos for the year and you distributed, let's say, 100%, then technically you are not bound to pay any corporate tax. The only tax that will be due the government will be the withholding income tax for the recipients, who in this case would still be, let's say, 66% is owned by the Cs, then they will be taxed in their personal level, and as well as the 1/3 by the investors. But at least on the corporate level, you will not have to pay. And this is year in, year out. So you save on the tax. The documentary stamp tax also, the law provides for 50% exemption on the original issuance. So, but that's a one-time issuance. Anytime you issue new shares, you'll have to pay 2 pesos for every 200 peso par value. So right now, it's 50% off. So those two are already very material for purposes of availing of a REIT. Because REITs really are pass-through entities. No? I think even in other markets, the idea is the funds will just pass through the REITs. Investors, however, get taxed.
But in the case of SM Prime, after transferring ownership to the REIT company or the special purpose company, will it not reduce its NAV? Because the malls have already moved out of the company.
The requirement, when you transfer that into a REIT, the REIT has to be listed. So
It is listed, but the net asset value of SM Prime should go down.
it will definitely adjust because you transferred it, but when you consolidate it, because it still will be under accounting purposes consolidated to the parent, I don't think an SM will lose more than 51%. Technically, it will still be consolidated at the parent company level. That was a discussion. That's why it took 11 years, because the SEC was requiring 2/3 to be divested. But right now, the only requirement is 1/3. Public float will just be 1/3 at the time of the IPO. So at 1/3, you'd still have 2/3 to be with the Cs, and that would still be consolidated in terms of the holdings.
Okay. For those clients that are making their questions, actually, we are giving you some prizes care of MyTrade's. So thank you so much for those questions. And if you still have more questions, by CIMB, sorry, we'd like you to be on the floor to ask those questions. Next, sir. Yes?
Good morning, Attorney Refran. Questions. First is, yung sa shorting, definite na ba na this year may implement siya?
So, yung short selling program, dependent on, if you're talking about, let's say, there's two types that we have for the borrowing. No? The borrowing can either come from what's called the broker-to-broker borrowing. They're borrowing on behalf of you. And that could also be used to fund your short. Or another model, which is probably the more transparent model, is the lending agency model. And that's yet to be launched because the PDTC, which is the potential lending agent, has not yet been licensed by our Securities Commission to function as a lending agent. Now, your question is, can you now do short selling under a program? Not yet, because until we get the lending agency model, we will then roll out the program itself. No? So, some of you here might say, but I'm already shorting. No? There's a risk to that, because if you do your short, and obviously you're borrowing, right? Because you're shorting, you don't have stocks, you're not long, and then you borrow for settlement. There are technically that the borrowing component should be taxed as well as a sale. As opposed to our program, the borrowing component will not be taxed as a sale, but be recorded really just as a borrowing, and you are obliged to return that, obligated to return that. No? So the broker doing the out of the framework that we have, if they're not availing of that, they will have the tax risk, the tax assessment, because under our tax code, if you borrow, you will have to pay documentary stamp tax. With one exception, if there is a securities lending agreement registered with the Bureau of Internal Revenue, it's exempt from the ST. And this we have since 2004, when I was then working with the Senate and the Congress. No? And on top of that, right now, there's an improvement. In 2008, Revenue Regulation of BIR also exempted the borrowing from stock transaction tax. But I'm saying if it's outside of our program, there will be stock transaction tax as well as DST. So that's also a very important consideration.
Thank you, sir. Second question. Thank you in advance sa PSE version 2. Kasi by experience, pagbayad ko ng IPO sa mga banks matagal dahil the teller basically doesn't know the IPO. So, dun lang sa pagbayad nyo online, will you incorporate other fintech elements like pwede mo siya through GCash, through Paymaya?
For version 2.0, we'll first have an API so that the banks can link so that you can pay through the banks. But we're actually talking to our subsidiary to incorporate, let's say, the modalities that you mentioned, no? Whether they be Dragon Pay or the fintech, the GCash. But I think our objective right now is for the participating banks to align their systems for payment so that you don't anymore have to line up. So I think because development is now ongoing, maybe that will be the next iteration, no? So the fintech side of it.
Can we expect the version 2 this year?
We want it this year because that's why we already have the source code being amended for the payment. But we need the banks to do their own customization because they will have to connect to an API, which is really a common point of contact for the banks. No? So we hope that they would also do side-by-side the developments with us. Right now, we're laying the foundation for that process.
We have one question from the text line. It says here, with Singapore having more experience with REITs, could you share what challenges you foresee for the Philippine market and probably the good experience that you have with Singapore?
Well, some of the initial challenge that we had when we first listed our REIT in 2003 was a lot of our local investors did not understand why and why they should invest in the REIT. Like the gentleman mentioned, a lot of these REITs were actually spin-off from existing listed companies. Now, but over the years, people have started to realize that yes, the properties belong to the original listcos. However, when they list these REITs, they are actually realizing the existing property prices at the market value. So they may be undervalued under the books of the existing listcos, but they may be selling to the market at, say, a 10% premium, right? So in fact, the listcos should have benefited from these spin-offs to a REIT. And next, we also benefit from the tax regime, right? So investors are actually benefiting on the whole. So that was the initial challenge that we had. And two, local investors or people in Singapore, they just cannot understand why REITs can be an income generating tool. But over the last 10 years, our market has become a REIT market that the investors are not even trading in shares. They are just predominantly parking their money in REITs. So that is one bad thing that has happened to the Singapore market. We have become less volatile because people believe so much in the REIT that they don't trade anymore. So these are the two challenges. And I think Philippines investors can learn from us is that adopt and embrace the REIT market quickly, faster, right? So that you can reap this return even earlier than what we have learned.
On a related question to that, is there how do we take advantage of it? How do we start investing, say, with, how do we open an account with CIMB? What's the funding requirements that would be, so that we could also probably take advantage of the Singapore REITs?
Sure. Well, it doesn't cost any money to open an account. right? We just have to do the standard KYC, your identity documents to start an account. So you don't exactly have to trade with us, but potentially access the research reports that we have our portals, start understanding some of our Singapore REITs and how it can apply to your local market. So to answer the question, it costs nothing to open the account. You have access to all the research material, whether you start trading with CIMB or you come back to Abacus and start investing in Philippines REIT or Philippines stocks. I hope that both these tools can expand the horizon of your investment perspectives.
Question from the floor?
Hello, Attorney Refran. No? I'm interested with REITs. No? Basically, on what I have understand in REITs is that the developer needs to raise capital from the investors. No? And you also mentioned that it should be listed, the REIT should be listed if it is an income-generating asset. So in development phase, can REITs acquire capital from the investors? And on our side, on our behalf, it is only a price appreciation pa lang ba? And second question is, how soon we will have to see the REITs in action in our market? Thank you.
Very good question. So this is not meant to be a modality by which they will fundraise for development purposes because there's a track record requirement. So the income producing, normally when we facilitate public offerings, the vehicle itself, the corporate vehicle, in this case, our REIT, Derek, is actually not a trust vehicle. It's a corporate vehicle, no? Peculiarities in our law. But nevertheless, we still call it a REIT. Normally, the corporation has to have track record already. But by way of exception for an REIT, if the asset has a track record of income stream, we will allow that to be tacked into the recently incorporated corporation, which is an SPV. Now, your question is, what if the asset is not yet been developed? No? Let's say you're developing an airport. That will be a regular corporation, except that there's no track record. So because of the lack of track record, we will not even allow that to be listed as a regular IPO, right? Except, for example, if it's a PPP listing, in which case we have what's called the private-public partnership rules. In fact, I'm talking to some of the proponents and sponsors among our big listed companies. The only requirement there at least is that at least one phase has to be in commercial operations. So if you're looking at a multi-phase development, for as long as you already have one phase in commercial operations, you could already qualify to be listed. So it's somehow it's a relaxation of the track record rule. So outside of that, unless you're a mining company also, no, where we relax the track record will have to apply. So a REIT still in the development stage will not qualify for listing unless the asset itself already has a track record, in which case the example given by our the investor a while ago is because it was already part of a listed company and there's already operations. So it's not meant to finance development. That cannot be a use of proceeds for an IPO of a REIT. How soon? This year we already have 3 very, very advanced discussions. I think one, of course, you've probably already read of that last year, right? Ayala was trying to beat the buzzer and they were targeting August of last year, no? But there's also the big ones. Of course, they're still preparing for the first REIT, no? So good scenario for investors to have. You have the quality of the tenancy base actually is the most important for any REIT, especially if you're looking at the income-producing vertical developments, right? If your tenants are not stable, then that will hit you on the yields. No? If you're looking at like in the S-REITs, the Singapore REITs, 6% average, when times go bad, I'm not sure if your tenants would still continue to do business, right? But so that's a qualification and that's a consideration rather, and it's more than just 1, 2, 3 years. It has to be medium-term consideration for you to properly value the REIT's cash flows, right? So I think we're all bracing ourselves for this new product. It's actually a new asset class for us, the way we see it. So it's good for you for 2020. No? So please support this product because it's really a yield play for you when you look at an REIT.
We'll have last two questions. Si Madam. Sige ko si.
Hello, good morning. The question is for both presenters. Since we already have short selling in REITs, what about options? Is this coming into the Philippines as well as in Singapore market? And option is not available. Was it? Is it a law or some market capitalization that's required, just like in the US?
So we have, right now we have actually a co-branded futures contract with the SGX, no? Of course, the underlying index for that is not our PSEI, it's the MSCI Philippine Index. So in terms of the futures products that we would have, actually that's on probably item number 2 on my list after the REITs, by way of formally launching derivatives functionality for purposes of hedging, no, or risk management. So I'm still ticking off the boxes for purposes of getting clearance from our SEC because, like it or not, we don't have yet registration rules for derivatives. If you look at the 8799 Republic Act 8799 and examine the provisions on how you would register for a public offering of derivatives, it says there the Commission will come up with separate rules. So we're working hand in hand with them because without registration, they cannot even apply to do listing with us. No? But I think the product design will not be any different because it's really a standardized forward contract. So we are going to really literally cut and paste. Of course, it will be denominated in Philippine pesos. And the underlying would have to be our PSEI index, no? Not yet the single stock options, no? But so that I hope to also be completed at least on the rule side within the year, the rule side, because then we would have to need a sponsor to actually spearhead the first futures contract. And not yet the other derivatives. No, I think we have to first learn to walk before we run, and it's really that very conservative approach we have. No? I'm not sure in other jurisdictions there.
In Singapore, we don't really have a lot of options trading, but we also have a vibrant derivatives market in the past, where a lot of retail investors traded warrants, which is a kind of derivative, akin like options. But in the last 5 years, this has dwindled down a lot because retail investors who have no knowledge about how options, warrants work have lost a lot of money. So in an effort to curb all these risks to retail investors, the Monetary Authority of Singapore has also sort of stopped producing this type of marketing materials to retail investors. And in fact, in Singapore, if you want to trade all these sophisticated products, you have to sign a specified investment product declaration before you can even qualify to trade this. So it's a chicken and egg thing. Less retail investors, less market participations means that less people want to issue these instruments. So I think from a risk perspective, on a retail perspective, I think it seems a bit risky and it cannot be blanket offered to all retail investors.
Last question from Anna. Kay Madam. Or
Hello. Hi, good morning. Are there any updates on the ASEAN capital markets linkage?
So you may be referring to the cross-border
Yes.
highway, no, I would call it, which we quietly discontinued, if I remember right, back in 2017, October of 2017. We started on this linkage which actually got off the ground between and among Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. No? So right now what we do is the cross-marketing, but no specifics or no concrete plans to actually interconnect again. However, without prejudice to bilateral linkages, I think what you see, for example, in Singapore is they do the bilateral connections, which in the Philippines we're also already discussing with Shenzhen Stock Exchange and even Singapore Stock Exchange. No? So I've had discussions with my peers in SGX as well as Shenzhen Stock Exchange. That should be fairly straightforward. We're not reinventing the wheel there, unlike compared to our ASEAN linkage. So here it's really just a cross-border transaction. We just have to clear the regulatory issues and the registration requirements. But to you as investors, actually this is also very exciting because then you would have visibility and access to, let's say, a Singapore-listed company. No? Please await because we will have to clearly provide for the qualification requirements. Because at the end of the day, if that highway is there, but the market awareness, because the companies listed in the Philippines are not known to our, let's say, partner in Singapore, in Shenzhen, then that's also a product that's doomed to fail, right? So there has to be marketing component here, and vice versa also for the other companies in Singapore and that are qualified to be traded here once we do the Stock Connect. So we're gonna do like a Stock Connect program here. That has to also come in first. No? So thank you for that question. I think that's also among our strategic projects for, should be this year also. No? As long as we get the SEC to give its go signal for us, because it's plug and play already. We're not gonna come up with an infrastructure. We're not gonna develop a common customer gateway like we did for the interconnection among the three countries. No?
Si Madam. Si Madam. Madam po. Yeah. Last. Yes po.
Attorney, you mentioned a while ago about the REITs that 90% of the income should be distributed to the stockholders and an equivalent niya is the dividend tax. How about the 10%? Do I assume that it would be taxed at corporate tax rate?
Yes, that will be taxed. If they don't declare 100%, then whatever is undeclared will be subject to the ordinary corporate tax rate.
Okay. Next question po. If Singapore had an average yield of 6.07% for REITs, meron po ba tayong projected yield naman for REITs if ever ma-roll out siya?
It depends on what the quality of assets will be. If it's an office space, like what we have seen, for example, the Ayala asset is really office spaces in Makati, right? In front of Makati Medical Center. So it will follow that the rental income, year-on-year growth, as well as the cash flows. No? So I think we're seeing a very robust real estate market, no? In part because of the inflows from all the POGOs as well for the office spaces. No? But based on our preliminary discussions with them, they would still have to come up with that range. No? We hope it's going to hit the 6% mark if it's really good quality assets. And that has to be sustained year in, year out. Remember, that's a yield. So it's like, just like when you look at any fixed income instrument, right? Although it's not promised, but the stick here is if you do not hit the mark, meaning you do not declare dividends, then you lose your tax exemption. But on the yields, it's really going to be a function of the demand supply for their office spaces in this case.
Last question po. Aside from REITs po, sir, are there other catalysts that you see that could help PSE rebound this year?
So it's really going to be, I would say, the ease in which companies are able to go public. No? Because for the previous year, there were companies that were already all set and then just at the last minute pulled the plug and decided not to do the REITs. I think the listing, I think the idea is, the question always is the market is low or small because of the lack of liquidity. In fact, questions on do we now introduce a market maker system, which is really not foolproof also. If you take a look at our fixed income market, the PDEX, there's a market maker requirement there, right? But then here, it's going to have to be a question of the participation by the retail investors, number one. And then the institutional money will come in once, obviously, they're able to see the market opportunities, because otherwise, we're not the only market that, if you look at the neighboring markets, they would probably have higher absorptive capacity for, let's say, $100 million dollar investment, or for that matter, $50 million investment, right? So it's probably a hodgepodge, a mix of all of these. I've been with the exchange for more than 15 years, and I've seen the index go through challenges, but at the end of the day, we really have to adopt the success stories of the other markets and realize also that our market is really very young for the investors, but the institutional take-up through the years has been also very much helpful. And I think relying on foreign investments to participate, that's going to be extra blessings to us, but the retail really has to see the merit of participating. That's why we always say you don't have to put in hundreds and thousands of pesos, no? Opening an account is just the first step. You have to trade. You have to make decisions, because we have some who have more than 300,000 accounts already. I will not name them, but the challenge with those securities firms is their trading is just 30,000 accounts out of the 300, that 10% trades. So it also pains me to hear that, because these are already people who have made the decision to open an account. But maybe lack of information, lack of opportunities for new products, constrain them and say, I will rather just put my money elsewhere, if ever they invest it.
With that, we thank you so much for our speakers.